everyone. My name is Emily Howard, and as president of Multiple Sclerosis Auckland, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Cognition in MS, and 5 Things You Need to Know. So thank you for joining us. Whether you're living with MS yourself, supporting a partner, friend, or family member, working in healthcare, or simply wanting to understand more, we're all very glad to have you here. Tonight's subject is an incredibly important one. When people think about multiple sclerosis, they often picture the symptoms that they can see: changes in mobility, balance, coordination, or the use of a walking aid. But so much more of the MS experience happens beneath the surface. People may be afraid to mention what they're experiencing, and they may worry about what it could mean for their future. But personally, I'm incredibly committed to helping lift the veil on these invisible symptoms. I'm so happy that we have tonight's guests with us. We've got Professor Hanneke Hulst and Brett Drummond, he's a familiar around here, and he'll be manning our Q&A this evening. Professor Hulst is an internationally recognized clinical neuroscientist whose career has focused extensively on multiple sclerosis, cognition, and the complex relationship between the brain and everyday lives. Her connection to MS is also deeply personal. Growing up with a mother who lived with MS inspired her interest in neuroscience and brain disorders. During her PhD, she began investigating one of the most important questions in the field: while some people with MS experience cognitive decline while others do not. She's brought this now remarkable depth of experience to Aotearoa. She is the director of University of Auckland Center for Brain Research and holds appointments in psychological medicine and the School of Psychology. Please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A or in the chat as we go. We'll do our best to cover as many of them as possible during the session, and we also encourage everyone to treat the experiences shared tonight with kindness and respect. Most importantly, I hope tonight leaves you feeling informed, reassured, and perhaps more comfortable beginning a conversation about cognition, whether that conversation is with your neurologist, your employer, your family, or someone else in the community. Professor Hulst and Brett, thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing your knowledge with us. It's my great pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you, Emily, for your kind introduction.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Hanneke, for joining us. Clearly a very interesting topic, and as Emily said, it's probably one that we don't talk about enough in terms of MS. We focus a lot on other symptoms like fatigue and like mobility, but I think more and more in the research space especially, we're seeing a focus on cognition. As a starting point, I think to really frame why we're talking about this, how common are cognitive changes in people living with MS?
Yes, thank you for this important question. And I think it is also a hard question because the percentages of people that will suffer from cognitive decline during the disease course, they're very broad. So then the numbers state somewhere between 43% until 65% of the people will at some point during disease experience cognitive problems. I think having worked in the field, we were having the pre-meeting for almost 20 years. I almost tend to say it's probably around 50% of the people that will struggle with this domain. Having that said, it also means that half of the patients will never experience any cognitive problems, which is, I think, also an important thing to note because sometimes people get scared when we talk about this topic. But I think it is also something that we just have to keep in mind. It doesn't have to happen, but if we don't talk about it, we can also not interact or act early enough. So I think it is important to bring it up, but also there's not always a need to worry. If you're feeling fine, you're doing fine.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's where our conversation is going to get to across the next hour, is talking about how do we detect this in people, which I think is a big question in itself. But then for people who do experience it, what can we do about it? So that is where we are going. So for people who are watching, those are things that we are going to be talking about because it is really important. I think what has added a lot to this as well recently is there was a finding, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which group it was, and you might remember, but a finding not too long ago that showed there's actually a group of people living with MS for who cognitive changes are the only symptoms that they experience, so that there isn't, they will go through without any of the other physical symptoms that we might often associate with MS. They won't have that, but the cognitive decline is what they will experience. How, I guess, important does that make this in terms of an area of research? And was that a surprise to you as someone who has been in the field for as you say, a while now? Did that finding sort of come out of the blue a little bit, or did your personal experience with it sort of make that not that unexpected?
It was not completely unexpected, but I can see that it's not recognized because I
Mm-hmm.
think MS is still very much a disorder that we recognize from starting with an optic neuritis or problems with vision or numbness in. It is the physical that really stands out. And I think talking about cognition, and then we're talking about symptoms like memory loss, problems concentration, focusing, attention. Um, we all know there are so many causes for these symptoms, and it can be as easy as if you're not sleeping well, you'll already figure it out the next day that you're forgetful. And this is obviously very normal and nothing is going on, but I think it is the subtlety of the change.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the fact that people are not thinking about it. And then we actually in the group of in Amsterdam, they recently actually studied an older age population that actually showed with memory complaints. And as you can imagine, these were directly referred to the dementia clinic because they were all having old age and memory loss. And then nothing really was looking like dementia, but it actually turned out to be in multiple sclerosis that was probably already a long time going. So it doesn't surprise me that the cognitive can be a symptom that is just the one and only symptom that some people experience. It's just that labeling that into the MS category is really different and really needs more work. So as you're stating, is really an important area of research. Like how do we capture this in time? And if I can bring up one of the case studies that I was involved when I was really young, I just started as a PhD student. And we had a girl, she was in the beginning of her 20s. She was studying pharmacology. And she suddenly started to forget when she was preparing, learning for an exam. When the exam was happening, she was completely blacked out. She didn't know a thing. And it happened over and over again. And she went to her GP saying, like, there is something wrong with my memory. And obviously, because we're talking about a 22-year-old one, very physically fit, the first thing the GP thought was this is psychological. There's something in terms of like she needs to perform and under pressure she cannot cope. So she was sent to psychologist. This person couldn't help her. She was sent to a psychiatrist. And in the meantime, we were 9 months into the process and she was still struggling. And it just became worse. And that was the moment that we actually said maybe we have to do some excellent scanning of her hippocampus. So the hippocampus, the brain structure above your ears, that is important for memory function. So we used a very high field MRI scanner to scan her hippocampus. And what we actually saw was that there was a lot of demyelination within that hippocampus, but we also saw white matter lesions typical for multiple sclerosis. So half a year after that moment, she actually started to develop physical symptoms fitting with the MS diagnosis. And I think what for me was most striking for starters, I was approximately her age when I was studying her, so it had a huge impact on me, but also the misunderstanding of the cognitive aspect being sent to psychiatry before you see a neurologist. And then also the other sad thing is that we lost about a year for her to start on the right treatment. And I think she did recover, but she never went back to university. So her cognition never got up to speed. And this is obviously a case that was quite particular and special, and we don't see it that often. But I think that sort of already alluded to me that it can be the first thing It can be something that's hard to differentiate from other things that, especially in that age group, you would probably think of first. And I think what we also learned over the years is that the relapses that people with relapsing remitting MS are known for, they can also be in the cognitive domain. So it's really something to keep an eye on actually during the whole disease trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting and really powerful story to explain, I think, where we are and where we need to get to. And I think we've probably made progress in this space over the past little while, but there's probably still a ways to go in terms of making sure that this is really well recognized. I think from one of the things talking about, obviously, that the person in that story was 22. When do cognitive changes tend to appear in people living with MS? Is it something that tends to occur after, I guess, at an older age, or is it more related to how long they've been living with the condition, or is it not associated with either of those things?
So it is a complex story, and I still cannot pinpoint it completely. So at least it means I have to continue. But I think there are a few things that we know. So we know that if the disease continues and there is more neurodegeneration, so the loss of brain cells, that actually even continue in the well, even if the immune therapies are doing their job well, we know the neurodegeneration may continue, and the more of the neurodegenerative component that is associated with cognitive decline. At the same time, so we do see that the further advanced, the more likely it is that there is cognitive impairment, but at the same time, we can see it already early in the disease. And for a moment, I'll try to start share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Go. So if you can see my slides now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if this is this is a study that was done in 2001, so it's quite a long time ago, but it's one of the most well-known longitudinal studies within the cognitive area. It's work from Maria Piamato from Italy, who actually studied cognitive impairment at the time of MS diagnosis. So just keep in mind, we're still looking at the physical component at this time, and we are actually usually not really concerned with the cognition at the time of diagnosis. So we normally do not pay attention. We normally do not offer a neuropsychological assessment. But she actually started doing neuropsychological assessment at this time of diagnosis, and she found out that 74% of the people at the time of diagnosis were completely fine. There was no impairment, but there was already 25% of the people showing mild to moderate impairment on these cognitive tests. And I think that was for me also a striking thing to know that this 25% more or less of the patients we normally actually miss because, as said, we are not paying attention at this time. She followed up this cohort 5 years later. And what she at that time point actually demonstrated is that it was like 50% of the people were showing like no impairment, while the other 50% showed mild to moderate impairment. Meaning that in these first 5 years, a lot happened already on the cognitive domains. And then at 10 years follow-up time, you actually see that it's in this cohort, it seemed to stabilize. So it almost seems to be the people that were not prone to develop any cognitive impairment in that first 5 years seem to be off the hook for the longer term. It may be that some people swapped groups. So we also see that sometimes cognitive impairment can improve. That is most of the time when we're talking about if people are very severely fatigued or have very severe issues with their mood. As soon as you can relieve the fatigue and the mood and the depression, you can see that sometimes the cognitive functions actually do improve. So there was no real cognitive impairment, but it was sort of like confounded by the other factors, which makes it also sometimes a hard thing to study because cognition interacts with all the other things that we need in life to be doing well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting graphic to highlight the fact that it can be there right at the very beginning. And I think every time you say something, I'm coming up with about 6 new questions that I want to ask, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But to everyone that's watching, do remember you can put questions in the Q&A box and we will answer them as we go through as well. And Fiona has put a question in, so thank you for sharing, Fiona. And I think it raises another important point that I want to talk about. But Fiona said sometimes the most frustrating thing is when people say it's just age and getting older. You know that there's a disconnect or a delay in response or memory recall, really hard to not get frustrated or angry with others. And I think that lines up with your case study around it sort of not being recognized. But obviously, any thoughts on that? But as well as Fiona's experience, how do we, with something like cognition, which we know in the general population will have issues as we age, especially now that with DMTs and the fact that people living with MS are living longer and are getting to those points, how do we, with something like cognition, distinguish between whether this is an MS problem or whether this is an aging problem?
Yeah, this is a question I got a lot of the times, and I think it is a very relevant and also a very hard question. And I think it is for now that we actually get the chance to see people aging with multiple sclerosis a lot better and have attention to it. There are studies, especially from the group in Buffalo, from Ralph Benedict, who is basically the person that started this whole cognitive area in multiple sclerosis. And you can actually differentiate between cognitive deficits related to aging versus cognitive deficits related to multiple sclerosis. So obviously, for yourself, it's hard to say, but a neuropsychologist, when we see the profiles, we know it's different from aging. So aging really comes with primarily the memory loss, while when we're talking about MS-related specifics, you see that especially the information processing speed slows down to start with, which is a result from the demyelination, that just the whole processing of information goes slower, also the ways how we think. Than the memory loss, but we see that a lot of other things usually stay quite intact, especially with the higher cognitive functions like planning or executive functioning is how we call it in the neuropsychology field. That actually stays quite on track until very long time, unless there is like such a severe damage to the brain that at some point you see all these different domains sort of like collapsing. But it is also something that develops very slowly in multiple sclerosis. So but having that said, if I see someone beginning of their 60s and they say, I feel like I'm a little bit forgetful sometimes, I cannot pinpoint whether that would be the MS or whether that's just like normal aging.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, you can actually even wonder, does it really matter? Because if you feel that something changes and you feel uncomfortable about it, we do need to do something about it anyway, independent whether it's multiple sclerosis or aging. I think it all deserves the attention. But usually you see quite a difference in these phases. An area, though, that we don't know a lot about is what happens in menopause. Because we know that, again, females that go through menopause also get problems with their cognitive, well, at least the perceived cognitive functioning. They have the feeling that they can focus less, that they get distracted easily. And again, we don't know how multiple sclerosis interferes with these phases. And maybe to do a little bit of like a sneak peek, because we just finished an online study, so this is definitely not the high end. I did measure everything, but we asked about cognitive deficits, like the perceived deficits, and compared females in menopause with MS and without MS. And what we actually see, and this was to my surprise, is that the females with MS are actually doing better than the females that are in menopause that are healthy. And one of our explanations for this is that persons with multiple sclerosis, they are already sort of, how do you say it, not used to, but they already live with a disorder that is uncertain, that can be different the next morning that you wake up. So I think they have a little bit more resilience in terms of dealing with changes in their situation and how their body responds. While for people that don't have a disorder, and they come into menopause, this may have a huge effect because they are just not used to having to deal with that their body is not reacting as they expect it to be. But it is sort of like a slightly positive point of view that it doesn't always mean things get worse, but you actually may get better through the phases of menopause. We have to confirm this, obviously, but I think it was really something I wouldn't have expected because I was hypothesizing that it would be worse.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It's almost as though having lived with it for a period of time, they've learnt to compensate more for what they're, and so it's not that sudden drop that then is
I
that
think
sort
it
of,
is really a
yeah.
compensation. It's sort of like, okay, I do feel there is a new problem popping up, and they are maybe more creative, more inventive
Hmm.
to work around it. While for people that are just known to do it one way, and that they have to sort of start doing what persons with MS already do for a long time.
Hmm.
So, but I don't know. We have to, but this came out. It was a group of 500 females, so it was not a small group that reported this.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. A few questions that have come through, and one going back to the data that you presented from Maria Pia Amato, just asking in that cohort, showing the percentage of patients, what was the sort of age group that was in there? Was it a varied age group, or were they all sort of within a similar? Because I know it was across disease duration, but did
I
they?
think it was a slightly, I think they all started off as relapsing remitting MS patients. So
Mhm.
I don't know the mean age by heart, but I would
Okay.
expect it would be somewhere between 25 and 40,
Okay.
and then followed up over time.
Okay.
But I have to look it up to be completely certain about the age range.
Mm. I mean, with the age part, there is some interesting work that's been done on pediatric MS or children living with MS and their cognition, and what can happen during that time. I don't know if that's stuff I remember hearing about it at ECTRIMS last year around some of the cognitive changes that can happen in these children and how it affects longer term. Is that work that you're sort of aware of and want to comment on? Sorry, this is definitely a question without notice, and I know that pediatric MS is not necessarily your area of interest.
Well, it is definitely something that I would be interested in. I never studied it.
Mm,
Obviously, we're talking in pediatric MS about a brain that's still under development. So I
mm,
think it's fair to say that the damage to the brain is probably having a bigger impact on the
mm,
developing brain than it has on the already adult brain.
yeah,
Or at the same time, it may be that there is some workarounds there as well. But definitely, children, pediatric MS is not spared in terms of the cognitive aspect.
yeah. Um, so we're getting, thank you for all of the questions. We will get through them. If we don't get through them in the next little bit, we will also have a dedicated Q&A session in the last sort of 10 to 15 minutes of this. So we will come back to some of them. But I think there is one that I have here that Sophie has asked. I mean, Sophie states as well, she's 32, diagnosed 2 years ago. But I guess just in general, she brings up another interesting, you mentioned a number of ways that cognitive um, dysfunction, cognitive issues can present in people living with MS. And Sophie brings up another one, which is essentially language issues. So talks about when it comes to getting words jumbled and feeling like your brain is having to reboot while talking to people. Does this count as cognitive impairment, cognitive decline? And there was a study that's very recent. We put it on MS Translate a couple of days ago, looking at word finding difficulties in people living with MS and showing that in the large part it was around 91% of people who experienced those word finding difficulties that came with cognitive impairment. But language difficulties in general, is that a common presentation of cognitive issues in people living with MS?
It is not, it is definitely present,
Mm-hmm.
and language is a cognitive domain and is considered, like if you fail on these tests, it is considered cognitive impairment. I think it is less common compared to the others, but it's also like, um, well, this is sort of a little bit like, I don't know the word now in English. We have a very stupid word in Dutch, but it is basically every person with MS is different. We know that from the MRI scans, we know that of the presentation, and it basically also holds for the cognitive profile. So if I'm talking about it's primarily slowed information processing, or it's like memory, that is on average something we recognize in terms of a pattern, but the language is definitely for some people a struggle, and for others it's not at all. So it is, we always, in a standard neuropsychological assessment, we will always include the language component to be sure that we actually have an impression on how people are doing in that domain.
Just as a follow-up question that Jackie has asked, with the online study that you've done, how many people were involved with that? Did you say it was around 500?
Yeah, so we had around 500 persons with MS participating, and no, it was 500 in total, and it was, I think, 300 persons with MS, females with MS, and 200 healthy females.
Okay, perfect. You sort of mentioned going through and doing the tests and things that you include in the test. So I think that is a really important thing for us to talk about. How do we measure or monitor cognition in people living with MS?
Yeah. So how do we measure it is we're still using neuropsychological tests that are the golden standard. So it's really like I have to sort of always think about my mother when I talk about this. So my mom, when she was having multiple sclerosis and had her first cognitive test, she actually said like, well, they made me do all these childish tests, and they were acting like I was a crazy person, repeating the grocery list 5 times in a row. She actually got quite rebellious in that aspect and didn't want to do her best because she felt like the test person was not taking her seriously. And then I said, Mom, you really have to do your best because now they are thinking you have problems, but you actually didn't put in the effort. These like simple puzzles or tests are actually still the only way that we know it relates to certain brain functions or some brain regions. And obviously it's not that black and white, but if you do something like list learning, like I give you a grocery list with 16 items and I ask you to repeat it, and I do this 5 times in a row, it tells me something about your hippocampal memory function for words in particular, and it allows me to see if you are able to learn. So over these 5 trials, I would hope that you will learn more and more words until the end. And for some people, you see, they can remember 4 words and they stick with 4 words. So you can see that there is no learning capacity. For other people, you will see they are quite easily in getting there, but they will never get to the full 16 words. So there is a capacity issue that tells us something about hippocampal functioning. The same holds if we do something like, and I know that a lot of people probably have had this, is that you have to name or read like the colors on a card, like just red, blue, yellow. And then you have to mention the real color of the blocks. And then in the final version, we're asking you not to read the word. So the word would say red, but it's printed in blue. And you want us to give the color of the ink. It tells us something about the frontal cortex and how well it's able to inhibit the first responses. And these tests, they seem very simple, but they tell us quite a lot. And we have data from healthy people and how they would score, so you can sort of make a comparison for that particular person from that particular sex with that particular age and a particular educational level. What would we expect this person to achieve? And then you can see if someone is above or below, and that will help us to determine if there's something going on or whether they are actually still doing well. Having that said, it never comes only with these tests because you always have to keep in mind and have to have an impression on how fatigued are people, how is it going in terms of depression, anxiety, how do they sleep? Is there anything else in their life ongoing that is maybe interfering with their cognitive performance? If someone is in the middle of a divorce, you can imagine that your brain is preoccupied with other things. And so that are all things that in the end come together in that judgment whether something goes wrong or not, and whether it's MS related or something else. In terms of monitoring, I think there is the International MS and Cognition Society in 2018 published some guidelines on how to do it. And they were saying, well, you only have to look for, or at least you look at information processing speed, verbal memory, visual-spatial memory, um, and you follow them like annually to see how they're doing. These guidelines are not followed anywhere in the world, I almost dare to say. So I think everybody knows we have to look at it and we have to follow up, but there's no time, there's no money, no capacity of neuropsychologists. Um, Also, I think the cognitive changes are not going so fast that I think an annual check would be far too often,
Mhm.
especially if you know that people are actually learning these cognitive tests. So the more often you do it, the better you get at it. So you also don't want to do it every time and just see a learning curve on how well you're doing, how well you are in doing the task. On the contrary, I think it is very important in the beginning of your disease to have some kind of reference point for the person themselves. And I think that is usually really lacking. And I think it's crucial to know how are you doing when the disease just hits you. And if you feel any change, that would be the next moment where you can say, now we have to check it again. And then you can look for their own values rather than the norm. And why I'm saying this, and this is especially happening in high functioning people, that we usually see when we test them, they are above average on everything.
Mhm.
But then they actually say, but I feel like I'm declining. But because you're doing so well, we don't have norms that really go in the upper range. And I think it is very upsetting if you experience things in your body in the way you perform, and then the neuropsychologist is saying, well, you're still scoring above average, so you probably are fine. So this reference measurement, I feel, is most important. And then after a change or when there are symptoms, you have something to fall back on.
So, in your ideal world, and I know we don't necessarily live in an ideal world where we have an unlimited number of neuropsychologists and unlimited number of resources to do these things, but I know you mentioned when you were showing the data from Maria Pia around this is not something that's routinely done. It's doing these assessments when a person gets diagnosed because it's not necessarily the focus at that time. But would you like to see these tests performed essentially at the earliest start of the disease to give that baseline? Or do you
Yeah,
think
I
that
think
could have other issues?
well, I think immediately at the start, you have a lot of other issues that you should focus on first. But I would
Mhm.
say within the first 6 to 12 months after the diagnosis, once you're started on disease-modifying therapies and you're stable, I think that would be a good moment to say, and this is the moment that we're gonna do a baseline measurement to see where you're standing. If there is something already declining, this is also the moment that you can actually start following up and put in some support. Having that said, and this is a disclaimer, there is not no such pill that will help you
Mhm.
get over it. But I think there is a lot of things we can do to actually help people to live with and to also help the environment to live with someone that has cognitive impairment.
Yep.
The other thing I think is if there is nothing ongoing, you just have that baseline, you know you're good, and then you're just good to go until you feel maybe we need to check because I have the impression something has changed.
Mhm.
And for me, it's really even though here in New Zealand, it's really for me a change compared to where I come from in the Netherlands. So neuropsychologists and psychological support is really more limited here than it was in the Netherlands. And I was already quite upset about it, how it was in the Netherlands. So it is sort of like a step back.
Mhm.
At the same time, in the last years, we developed a digital screening tool that doesn't require any personnel. So it is on an iPad. People come in for their consultation with the neurologist. If they come in like 20 minutes before their appointment, if they're placed in a quiet room, they can just do 3 tests on an iPad, and the neurologist will immediately get their results. And that is not a replacement of the complete full-on 3-hour neuropsychological assessment, but it is a conversation starter. So if you see that everything is in the green and going well, then the neurologist doesn't have to talk about it. But if you see that something pops up being orange or red, saying this is a domain that probably needs a question, like, hey, I see there are some problems on your memory? Do you actually experience symptoms, or do you have problems in daily life? Is your partner making comments about your memory, whatever, so that it becomes a topic that the right support will get into place, as well as, again, the fatigue, the mood, sleep, that all needs to come together. And one of the reasons why I'm saying this is I remember very clearly I once met a couple, and he was having multiple sclerosis and she was well, they were married, and she said to me, "It's such a relief that you're finally talking about the topic of cognitive impairment, because we didn't realize it was part of multiple sclerosis." And she said, "I'm also quite sad I had just learned now about it, because it would have saved us 5 years of couples therapy." Because she thought he wasn't interested in her, but because he was never asking about how was your day, how was this important meeting at work. But he couldn't, he just forgot. So it was not that he was purposely not interested, he just didn't know. And she said, like, going through that grief that your relationship is changing was really hard on them. And she said, if I knew it was the MS, it wouldn't have changed a thing in our day to day, because he would still be forgetful, but I wouldn't blame him. We could have looked for external cues to help him remember by setting an alarm, like she's having an important meeting. Maybe it's nice to ask at the end of the day, how was your day? But also, I think for her to find the support, if he was unable to do it, how can she take care of her own needs? And I think that discussion was never part of their couples therapy. So in a way, I think a lot of things that are very important to people, like their partner, their children, their social life. Not talking about it is also meaning that you cannot work around it with each other. And I think in terms of quality of life, that's really, really important to keep that going. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm so strong about let's talk about it and let's act when we see something is going on.
Yeah. I actually want to ask you about the flip side of that in a second. But before I do, Anna's asked a question, and it sort of came up in one of the things you were mentioning just before. But she wants to talk a bit more about the interplay between fatigue and cognitive processing. And I guess in particular around when you're doing these testing, how, if it's on a day when a person is feeling, we know that day to day people living with MS have different experiences. Some days are worse than others. How can that be taken into account that a person's just not having a day where there's so much else going on that, is really impacting on how they perform in these tests?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that in the hospital where I worked, we always did it in the morning. Again, you always have people that are doing better in the evening, but at least by starting the day fresh, that was sort of like setting the daytime to the most optimal performance. I think the other thing is usually when you have a good neuropsychologist, they will ask about how you're feeling before you start, so that to have a little bit of an idea and to make a note if someone was really extraordinary fatigued. This also doesn't, this is not particular to MS. So a long time ago, I did some research on 18-year-old twins to study the heritability of intelligence. And I had to go through testing. And I know that I had for 1 week, it was the week after they had their exams that they passed for high school. And so they were all partying and celebrating. And I think the test scores were really not benefiting from the fact that they were partying just the night before. So this is a common thing for everyone. And I think it is just about either making a note, like there was severely something happening, or whether there's a heat wave or something ongoing that may interfere with the results. And the other thing is, especially for research purposes, to always do it at the same time of the day. So maybe you're not on your most optimal part, but at least you keep that the same, and therefore the comparison and the change will be as similar as possible.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions to get through, and I'm mindful of time. And I think we need to talk about a really important part of this discussion, which is what can people be doing to help themselves? And Michelle has asked that as a question as well. So we've gone through that these problems can exist. It's not uncommon in MS. We can measure it. We can find out who's affected. But at that point, or I guess even in people who haven't yet experienced it, what can be done to try and prevent it? Or if you're experiencing it, what can be done to try and try and help it?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one. So if so one of the things is if you experience anything in relation to your cognitive functions, I tend to say always make it a topic of discussion either with your MS nurse or your neurologist or your GP, dependent on where you live and what access you have to healthcare. Because I think what happens a lot is that people think that there are other causes for their memory loss or for their slowness. So either I have a busy job that's really demanding, or I have busy children and they sort of like distract me all the time. But I think it's just by putting it on the table, asking for that screening or that baseline cognitive assessment is something that only will happen if you bring it forward yourself. And that sounds maybe something that I'm not saying that the neurologist is wrong about it. The neurologist is just focused on the medication, the treatment, the physical. So this is something you really have to own yourself and put it on the table and ask for help in that domain. Once we know what's going on, you can either get there are strategy trainings. So it's called like compensatory strategy. So how to help yourself deal with the deficits that you have. And this sounds sometimes like open doors, like you have to keep a diary if you always set your alarm, or if you go shopping, make sure you always write down what you have to buy. But doing that, if you actually get it into your routines, you will actually find out that you're not suffering in day-to-day life from the problems that you're having. In research terms, there is also some work on brain training, which is, I think, a little bit undecided whether or not it works. It doesn't harm really, but what we see is that people, when they do brain training, they get better in the training they are doing, but it doesn't really translate into day-to-day activities. The other thing you can do, and this holds for everyone, whether you already feel something's going on or whether you feel fine, it is just the general brain health kind of guidelines that we have for everyone, and that becomes even more important if you're having MS. So I'm talking about exercising, try to keep as active as you can, even if you cannot, if you're dependent on walking aids or a wheelchair. I think there are other ways of moving that can still help the perfusion and the blood perfusion of your brain, that will help for your brain health. Eat healthy, meaning just enough vegetables, be spare with red meats, don't drink too much alcohol or preferably avoid it, don't smoke. I think all these normal healthy habits. It's about sleep. Pay attention to your sleep. Sleep is like a really tremendous important aspect of brain health. And if you have trouble, also try to find help to get back into that cycle of good sleep. And potentially, I think what's really important as well is to try to challenge yourself, and especially in terms of the cognitive aspects. If something becomes harder, so if you like to read a book and you suddenly feel that you cannot do it anymore because you cannot follow the storyline, try to read like short stories, or don't avoid it completely, but try to challenge yourself to keep doing it, or do something totally new. So learn a new skill, learn a new language, do some creative things, but just try to, yeah, to stimulate a brain to grow the new connections and to keep busy. And I think that is the hardest thing if you're not feeling well. And if you feel you struggle, this is a challenging thing, but it's really going to be beneficial for your brain.
Yeah, and I think, and you mentioned this right at the beginning, and I think it's a really important thing just to talk about briefly before we get into questions. So for people who might be having questions, we're going to go straight into Q&A time in a second. We already have quite a few to answer, but we'll try and answer more. So if you do have questions, now's the time to put them in the Q&A box. But you mentioned that there can often be a little bit of fear around cognition and cognitive problems for people living with MS in terms of what it's going to mean. And I know when we post about this, there's a concern for people around, if everyone thinks that people living with MS have cognitive issues, this is going to impact on my employment and how people look at me at work and things like that. But the benefits of having an awareness around it as well is that having those people close to you be able to sort of also be that self-monitoring tool of, hey, I've noticed that maybe your responses are slightly slower, or you're forgetting things a little bit more, that can be really important. So how do you balance, or how would you talk to, I guess, the audience around balancing those two things of, yes, we can understand that this may be not something that you necessarily want to address because you're worried about how it will change things for you, versus the benefits of being able to have an open conversation around it can be really helpful.
Yeah, and this is, well, this was really this morning in our team meeting, the topic of discussion, like how do we do this? And I think for starters, you hope that healthcare providers are saying like, hey, I'm your neurologist, I am here to take care of you. And that means that I will always ask you a few things about how is your walking going? How is your bladder function doing? How is your vision? How is your sexual function and how is your cognitive functioning? And if you put it into that whole package of, I need to take care of you and I need to know how you're doing with the healthcare provider, it could be just something that is commonly checked without a lot of weight to it until you actually experience problems. I think for me, it would be like, and I'm happy that people are joining tonight, is just the awareness that it could be a possibility. Um, and if you sort of like check in with yourself and feel like I'm completely fine, I also sort of like want to emphasize, just forget about it. And whenever something happens, I'm sure you will remember this lecture and think like, oh, this may be something that I need to pay attention to. And the same holds, I think, for the surroundings. The fact is, though, that these cognitive symptoms, the surrounding will actually do, it will also impact the surroundings. One of my reasons to study this topic, because my mom suffered from this cognitive decline. The neurologist was saying it's just a fatigue. And I knew living with her from day to day, this is not just a fatigue because the fatigue's always there and this is something different. Um, and it is also something like knowing with each other, how can we help? And I think just having that one-time conversation that everybody's aware, and if it's not playing a role, please forget about it. And once you're there, you will at least have all these tools in the back of your head that you know I have to talk about it. I can ask for help with a psychologist, and there are ways to get this going.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there are definitely people that say, I just want to deal with it once I get there. And I think that is always the tension between the right to know and the right not to know. And I think that is really hard. But from my perspective, up to 20 years of research, my feel is really like the sooner you can interact with the fact that this is happening, the more we can do to keep life as normal as can be. And the more severe the problems are, the harder it is to get back to normal. So, what we see often is that, especially in the workplace, people are not talking about it for understandable reasons. Don't get me wrong there. And then you see that you fail to meet your deadlines, that something happens, and then at some point you're in a conflict with your employer. You're sitting at home and then finally, we find out that actually she's unable to do it. But then, because there's already a conflict, it's very hard to get back to adjusted work. So, whenever you feel safe in the workplace or have trust that your employer is doing a good job, there is a lot of things that you can do in the workplace to still keep you going in employment rather than that you fall out of the cognitive impairments. And I think that is really coming from a country that has a very strong social secure network by the government. So in the Netherlands, people they will be paid for 2 years when they are sick and unable to work by the government and by the employer. So there's a lot of collaboration on that end to keep people in the workforce. And I see a lot of good things coming from that. But I understand if you're afraid that your contract is not going to be prolonged, that it feels hard to bring this up. But the sooner you're there, the more we can do to maintain what's there.
Yeah. It was a very complicated question. I think you've done an amazing job of answering that. And I can tell already from the questions that we've got that just from people listening into this and hearing your insights and your knowledge is already making people feel a lot more confident around addressing this as a topic. So I think this has been really good. With the few remaining minutes that we have, I'm going to do a little quick fire Q&A from some of the questions that have come through. Mike and Enders have both asked a similar question about the iPad test that you mentioned being available for people before their neurology appointments, and just asking whether or not it's publicly available.
It's not yet, and it's probably not going to be publicly available because there's, as said, because people can learn and improve on the tests. We don't want them to be freely out there. It's really one of my first and foremost aspirations to get it translated as fast as I can into English, which shouldn't be hard because there's only one language dependent test in it, and the others are non-language dependent. And try to get it on this side of the world implemented as well.
Perfect. So Denise has asked, also I've read previously that the location of the lesions can relate to the various symptoms people from. So for cognitive decline, is this typically in the hippocampus area that you described?
Um, so yeah, it is not really about the lesions necessarily, but it is about where the neurodegeneration is happening. So next to the hippocampus is really responsible for memory, and therefore we see that hippocampus seems to be quite prone to MS pathology. Another area in the brain that's really central is the thalamus, which is basically the relay center that gives all the signals to all the other sides of the brain. And what we see happening there is that there is atrophy in the thalamic structure, and once that is more prominent, we actually see that cognitive deficits are more pronounced. So there is definitely a link to the damage in the brain and the cognitive symptoms that we see.
Well, you've done perfectly there because I think you've answered Jane's question, and Jane gives some details around her experiences. 49 years old, just left her work as a health professional because she couldn't cope cognitively anymore. And she'd done some analysis that suggested significant brain atrophy. And I guess based on your answer, you've sort of already answered this, but a cognitive issue strongly correlated to brain atrophy more than, I guess, lesions.
Yeah, correct.
So we've got two more that I have here to finish off, and then I'll hand back to Emily to close things out. So there's a question here. Person who was diagnosed with ADHD, then relapsing remitting MS after that, has been previously diagnosed with other psychological conditions, anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue. But wondering, and I guess obviously we can't answer this from an individual perspective, but in general, is there much known at all about how some of these psychological conditions that might coexist with MS impact on cognition and whether treating them improves the cognitive functioning? So there was a specific question around ADHD, but I think you mentioned already depression is one that we know that if that can be treated, it can improve cognition.
Yeah, and ADHD is obviously something that I hear quite a lot. Sometimes I even think we probably have to study what the incidence is of having a comorbidity with ADHD because I hear it quite often. I don't know. We have treatment for ADHD and it has been tested in multiple sclerosis to see if, so this was people with multiple sclerosis without ADHD, giving them ADHD medication to see if that would improve the cognition. And the sad story is that it didn't. Having that said, if you do have ADHD, I think it is always worthwhile to try, if you treat the ADHD, what happens to your cognitive performance, like with the depression. So if I have someone with the depression and cognitive impairment, I will always go for treating the depression first. And then afterwards, see what happens to the cognitive performance. Did it improve or is it still at the same level? If it's still at the same level, we know it is probably MS related because we sort of solved the depression. The same holds with the ADHD, but there is no proof that ADHD medication in itself is improving cognitive functioning in persons with MS.
And I think this is where, I mean, there's so many things that are all linked together here. I mean, we know from carrying on with the depression story, we know that depression can also impact on sleep and cause sleep dysfunction. We know that then sleep dysfunction can play into other things like cognition. So it may be that treating the depression improves the sleep, which then improves. It's complicated. There's a lot going on, but in general, I think if we can have open conversations around these things and talk about them and raise awareness, it can help. So the last one along a similar line is someone talking about a sort of anecdotal experience from their personal life of steroids, and after having a steroid treatment, feeling like that it improves their cognition. Is there anything that you've seen from the research around how steroid treatment may have an impact on cognition. I can't say that it's anything I've seen hugely, but you would know better than me.
I don't know, and I haven't seen the studies
Mm,
either. I know that from steroids, people are having a lot of like, how do you say it? That people are also sleeping less, so they get this
hmm
sort of like totally on kind of phase. So I can imagine that it's just temporary, gives a boost to
hmm
your system, and that it feels like you're clear. The other thing is that I also know the other side around that people just feel more cognitive complaints. So I don't know the exact one-on-one relationship between the two.
Yeah, perfect. Well, look, in the interest of time, Hanneke, I'm going to say a huge thank you on behalf of our audience for what was a hugely interesting and insightful past hour. I have about a million other questions, and we could talk for another 12 hours, but I think everyone probably, we've talked about how sleep is important, so we won't put people through that. But from me, thank you, Emily. I'll hand back to you to finish this off.
Thank you so much, Brett. Well done. You're a natural and love the way you field the questions and really bring it to life. And of course, Hanukkah, my gosh, you're the brave one of so many, and you're a champion of mine because you're bringing out all of the questions and the topics that are just too hard sometimes and maybe even embarrassing. As a woman who's got MS and menopause, I can totally relate with so many things. So I've learned much, much more than five things tonight. But I think the key message for me is advocate for yourself and see if you can get those benchmarks early. If you can see where your own trajectory goes, that's probably the better thing in your history. So huge thank you to both of you. Honored to have you here. I know of the 58 participants here today. I'm sure we'll hear lots on social media and all the great things that you guys are doing. So with that, I will say good evening, good night, and bless everyone here for us and into the future.
Well, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Brett. It was a pleasure to be here in my first online New Zealand webinar. Hopefully more to follow.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.